Let's dive into infill, the counterpart to shell thickness. If we wish to protect our part against tension, compression and shear forces, we will need to rely on shell thickness and internal infill this time. For most parts, the default shell thickness is going to be good enough, but what we might have to do is tweak the infill settings a little bit. There is two settings we're going to play around with, and that is the infill pattern and the infill percentage. First, let's cover the infill pattern, and this is just what is actually going to be the structural pattern of that infill that'll fill our hollow shell. Now there are a lot of infill patterns to choose from, but we're just going to go over 4 of them that should cover your bases for most of your parts. Grid infill. Now this pattern comes default under the speed presets in Prusa Slicer. And that's because it's going to be your bread and butter for most parts that you'll print. It's pretty quick to print with, it doesn't use much material, and it's reasonably strong. And these properties are thanks to its just simple grid layout, as you can see. Rectilinear fill. This is similar to grid, but if we look closely, we can see that it lays down alternating layers in this crisscross fashion. And this is going to make it a weaker infill, but it's going to use the least plastic, and it is going to be by far the fastest to print. So it's a good infill for any part that's not going to be exposed to too much forces, and you want to save on a bit of time and costs. Honeycomb. Now, this one's a bit more situational. It's going to be the longest to print by far, and uses the most material, but it is going to be the best infill against compressive loading along the Z-axis here. Just be aware, on some prints this one can take a long time to print. Gyroid pattern. Now this is a really cool one. It comes default on the quality settings in Prusa Slicer, and thanks to this really weird circular pattern that it puts down, it puts it in the upper end in terms of strong infills. It is also a bit on the longer side to print, not nearly as long as Honeycomb, but it's got this really cool unique thing, and that is, it's good against compression forces from any angle. Whilst Honeycomb and other infills are really great against compression along the Z-axis, they are typically weak to horizontal compression, and that's why Gyroid is such a handy infill to use. The other setting is infill density, and it's just a flat percentage from 0 to 100, and it usually defaults from 15 to 20%. As you would expect, a higher infill density is going to make your part stiffer and stronger, but also use more material and take longer to print. The default infill values are pretty good, decrease if you need to save some weight and print times, increase if you need a bit more strength. Just be aware you will get diminishing returns if you increase that infill over 40 to 60%, and it is pretty uncommon to print above 60, maybe even 40 infill density. Printing at infills of 70 to 100% is going to be some pretty rare and extreme cases, as you will chew through material and you can blow out your print times into the days. As always, examples are the best way to learn, so let's look at some parts I've printed and what settings I've actually used. The keys on this keyboard here, they're not going to be exposed to too much force, and if we look from the side, they've got a bit of a low volume to surface ratio. Because our volume is our infill and our shell is our surface area, the shell thickness is going to determine part strength more on this. Knowing all that information, I'm going to keep the shell thickness at default because it's going to be strong enough, but we can afford to drop down the infill a bit. We don't need it to be that strong. The shells on these parts are going to take most of the brunt, so let's use as little infill as possible here, save on some print times. 4 of these things sit under the legs of a big heavy workbench, just so I can raise it up an inch. Now that means we're going to see a lot of compression along the Z-axis here, so let's get out the big guns and select Honeycomb. For these things, we don't really care about weight, so I'm going to bump it up to 75% density. It is a pretty small part, and we're going to be using it for a few years, and we don't want it to fail, so we can forgive the extra material usage and the extended print times. I don't think this warrants 100% because we're not going to see that much of an improvement in terms of strength, and because we need 4 of them, remember it is quicker to print them all at once, so we're going to save some print time by doing that. Exhibit C. You get a few of these things, some aluminium extrusion, and you can put together a little shelf that sits on a desk. Now it's not a big shelf, but it will take some light to medium forces, nothing too extreme. So I think I'll just leave it on the default settings of 20% and grid infill. This is a giant dice that I'm printing, and it is a perfect example of something that might take a compression force from any which angle. So to protect against this, you guessed it, we're going to be using the gyroid infill. Now the density, I'm just going to bump it up a little bit, nothing too much, just 30%. In this example, I'll also change the shell thickness from the defaults, maybe just to 3, just bump it up a little bit, give it a bit more strength. Context time. Everything I've ever printed, I think about 40% of the time it's just been grid, 30% of the time it's been rectilinear, 20% of the time it's been gyroid, and 10% accounts for every other infill pattern. And when it comes to densities, you're just gonna have to bear with me. I can't remember all these numbers in my head. 40% of the time I've left it on the default 15 or 20 density. 25% of the time I've dropped it down to a lower number. 25% of the time I've printed in the 25 to 40 range. 9% of the time in that 40 to 80 range. And I think about 1% of the time I've actually printed in the 80 plus range. And of everything I've ever printed, I think there's been one or two things that I've printed on 100% infill. Final thing, there is another type of infill that you can change. It's not related to this internal infill structure, it is the top and bottom layer patterns. The printer's going to have to fill in those top layers somehow, but you can actually tell it what sort of pattern you want it to fill it in with. You don't have to touch this setting though, as there's no other reason to do so other than just aesthetic choice.